Will Mbappe join former teammate Neymar and childhood idol Cristiano Ronaldo in the Saudi League? Probably not. But still, it brings up an interesting question of how much of our lives has become the Saudi Pro League. Now, in terms of transfers and in terms of older stars, we see a lot of them at least have Saudi Arabia brought up as a potential move, and a lot more of them take that move. Everybody from Karim Benzema to Neymar have recently made the move and then allegedly regretted it. But it's not just players who seem to be disliking this league in general, but it seems like that the influx of super popular players hasn't actually translated to any direct correlation with increasing competitiveness in the league or increase in, media awareness of the league. Instead, actually, oftentimes it seems like the league has only gotten worse PR for it, from players complaining about the style of play and overall the situation they put themselves in, to just in general people looking at Saudi Arabia still as more of a retirement league than an actual competitive league. So, what's the issue here? Why is Saudi Arabia not seeing this influx of play and influx of fans that they expected? The answer comes in the same strategy that they've been trying. Buying big players doesn't actually end up helping, and instead it creates a dangerous cycle which sows the seeds of its own destruction. Saudi Arabia's big wallet was its birth and can also be its death if they're not careful. There's a few ways in general that Saudi Arabia has really shot itself in the foot in terms of its ability to just buy big players and then expect these grand results. One of these ways is with the actual tactical side of the game. Now, when we look to big stars, we see a lot of them have very good tactical styles. They're very incredible players. Cristiano Ronaldo dominated the game for a long time. Players like Karim Benzema have won the Ballon d'Or, and players like Neymar have always been in parts of contention for these major awards and incredible styles of play. So what is it that isn't clicking? Well, ultimately, it's the fact that you can't just throw one good player on a team and expect it to work. You can't even throw 4 good players on a team and expect it to work. In Europe, we can see this kind of theme happen with PSG, where they continue to throw in these big budget players and yet continue to not be able to achieve anything. Now, Saudi Arabia is like PSG, like times 10, because instead of buying several really good players, the clubs tend to buy one really good player and expect it to work because they build their strategy on this one player. Now, the reason that this is so damaging overall to the strategy of the game is because that one player instantly becomes a target, and when you build and craft your strategy around that one player, you cut off multiple passing lanes. Two defenders on one man can get rid of up to 4 different passing lanes in the game, ultimately leaving the team that wanted the player to help them succeed so bad left with nothing, and oftentimes even left worse off than they were before. Now, this kind of strategic mismatch happens not just because of the massive stardom, but also because of that big budget. Because you only spend the majority of that transfer budget and transfer deficit on that one player, you're unable to fill the requirements of others. This is a trend we've seen across all football. Look at the MLS in its early days. People like David Beckham, even Lionel Messi nowadays, cannot make a team incredible by themselves because a lot of these players require that needed support of a team. After all, you can't play a game of 1 against 11 and win because that's not how the sport works. And even when Saudi Arabia gets more and more players into these areas, these players are far past their prime, and oftentimes they're injury prone, just like with people like Neymar. And if they're not injury prone, then overall they're not as quick as they used to be. They're not as good and athletic as they used to be, which isn't against them, it's just a natural part of aging. Part of being an athlete is eventually you're gonna have to retire, and that's why so many of them decide to get their massive bag and go. But this aging hurts the strategy even further, because if we're basing our entire strategy off of a player's prime and off of one player and one player's prime, it will not have the needed effect. It won't create this incredible team in general, and one player doesn't heighten the rest purely because they used to be incredible. Instead, it puts a massive target on their back, and more importantly, puts the team in jeopardy and at risk of losing more and more, which continues to only hurt the team and encourage the players and the teams to keep buying these big names, which ultimately just creates that endless cycle. Investment. a huge part of any league. And investment is so crucial when it comes to the future of leagues. Now, what is Saudi Arabia investing in? Largely they're investing in foreign, typically European players who dominated their European leagues. But they'll also settle for some others, with one of them offering a new opportunity to allow people to play in the third division and get paid a lot of money to do so. But is anybody really taking it? No, not really. They've seen some success, but overall, the success has been muted and minor. And more importantly, this doesn't apply necessarily to Saudi Arabian born players. Instead, it's going out to other countries and asking for the same thing, hoping to sort of cultivate a future, but it's a future based on outside transfers, which, if we look at any team, isn't a future that's particularly viable. Now, what is Saudi Arabia doing domestically? The answer is very little. The hope, what Saudi Arabia's original plan is that in their ability to invest in these big name players, they'll get kids and such interested in the sport enough to, pursue it and eventually get good enough to be on those pro teams and therefore create a sustainable future. The only problem is when these big players can't perform because of those tactical issues that we talked about earlier, it disinterests kids and declines on headlines, which ultimately leads to less and less of the interest that Saudi Arabia is looking for, creating that kind of double take paradox wherein you can't really have that kind of interest if they're not investing in it. And so instead of buying these big name players, maybe Saudi Arabia should take a step back and instead invest in their own players, invest in proper youth academies, and invest in creating new spaces where football becomes a culture. When we look to places that have the highest levels of players going out internationally, places like Brazil, football is a part of the culture. Overall, there's a culture around it, and investing in that culture, creating a space where kids are allowed to explore this opportunity and this sport is essential to creating a future for a league. So instead of paying a player $1 billion a year, instead take that $1 billion and invest it into infrastructure and individuals who can continue to promote the sanctity and the future of a league. Because it's not sustainable to just keep hoping that retirees will keep flocking to your league and making the same poor financial choices which hurt you in the first place. When you're playing in a league where you don't particularly like the situation, or a league that you never super wanted to go to in the first place and were instead more forced into, you're not going to have the same passion to play. And overall, just as you age, you may not have the same passion to play. At the end of the day, these retirement leagues aren't as passionate because at the end of the day, a lot of these players are there especially for that big check, not for the big wins, because a lot of them may not see it as a big win because it's just the Saudi league. So this player passion then affects how they play and affects the performance. And when you have that, again, that tactical piece and that lack of investment, you ultimately see that players don't have the support and don't have the technical and tactical abilities given to them to actually play with that kind of passion in a way that matters. Now, this technical failure ultimately leads to less passion from players, and that bleeds into fans. Now, in terms of fans in the Saudi League, when we first saw players like Ronaldo make it, ticket sales skyrocketed, right? It was a big thing. Everybody wanted to see their childhood idol on the pitch. But as the headlines went away, so did the fans. With routinely, we're seeing Saudi Arabian games not get a lot of coverage. And I'm not just talking media coverage, but actual fans in seats. Time and time again, there's one small section of an entire stadium with just about a couple thousand people. This is nothing compared to the thousands and thousands of seats available, and nothing compared to the thousands and thousands of seats filled every time a European or even a Latin American club plays. Heck, even the MLS tends to see better and bigger numbers. And why is this? Well, it's the same reasons as before. The tactical performance of these players is downgraded, so nobody really wants to see it. And that then downgrades passion. The lack of domestic investment gives people less of an attachment to the game, decreasing passion and overall their willingness to support it. The problem is it goes back to that central buying. When we continue to buy these big name players, they do generate headlines and they do generate some fans for a little bit. Then people realize that it's not the same player that was playing in Europe. They don't have the same tactical advantages, and overall, they don't give the same appeal. And so the headlines disappear and people stop watching. And without any real domestic pull to bring them in, they're going to be gone forever. Once again, we see a cycle. Now, I'm a big fan of pointing out cycles and things, and if you watch any of my other videos, you will definitely know that. But in general, it's this cycle of destruction that Saudi Arabia is trapped in that's so interesting, yet also so detrimental. So when we look at it, their first step is to buy these big players, right? And huge, massive, like, budgets, spending all this money, and so they spend all this money, so they aren't able to invest domestically. Now, they design their whole tactics around this one player that they spent all this money on, and then that player tactically doesn't do very well. So now fans are upset. There's a lack of passion from player and from fans, and you've kind of wasted a lot of money. So what do? Well, you do the same thing that worked for a little bit. You go back to buying those big players. So then we're back in the cycle of buying big, not investing, failing tactically, losing passion, and buying big again. Because overall, Saudi Arabia has trapped themselves in a cycle of spending that's not helping their league, is only hurting them, and instead, they really can't seem to get out. Key to breaking that link is the next time that there's dispassion, the next time you're struggling, stop going back to the thing that only worked for those 15 seconds of fame and instead go the other direction. Invest domestically and invest in a true game that's actually going to provide benefit. Don't pay for a big player just because they're a big player and will bring big headlines. Instead, invest in big changes to big sports that will ultimately actually create that net benefit that the Saudi Arabian Pro League actually wants to see. If the Saudi Pro League ever wants to be a competitive league that people take seriously, they need to stop buying big names and instead start focusing on themselves. And